Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. It's Ukraine War news update, second part there for the 18th of March 2024. Another reminder, there was a live stream last night that was informational, Q&A, but also a fundraising event, and we did a magnificent job and we hope to continue that. So please check out the live stream last night and donate if you can, if you have the wherewithal and desire, to our armoured medevac vehicle fundraiser. It's really important to us and will allow us to continue to help Ukraine in all the important ways that we can. Anyway, thanks aside, we'll move on to military aid and equipment. Slovenia will join the Czech initiative to supply artillery shells to Ukraine, €1 million. Thank you to Slovenia. So that's great, good stuff. That is gathering some serious momentum still. Now, on the back of that, Thierry Breton, who's French European Union treasurer, I think, but he's been involved with trying to get the million shells to Ukraine that were pledged last March. And they've got to the end of the March to try and achieve that. But like I've said before, it's just a number, right? They made a rod for their own back because they said, we're gonna give 1 million shells. Then they realised that actually that's really difficult to turn a tanker in terms of production facilities inside Europe. And then there was all the arguments about whether they buy in or out of Europe. And then they decided they can go outside of Europe. And then the Czech initiative took place. And is that part of the European thing? And et cetera, et cetera. So the end result is Ukraine are getting a load of ammunition and they'll get it going forward, and then this is high on the agenda and it will continue to be, and the European production capacities have been massively ramped up. So I wouldn't bother about whether they've hit 1 million by March or not, because if they'd said we're going to hit 500,000 by March, people would have been like, oh, that's a good amount. It's called in psychology, it's called an anchoring bias, and they've anchored you to 1 million. So you think that is a normal or good amount. If they just said 500,000, then they would have hit it, and people would be going, oh, well done, Europe, you've hit that, and you've given a bit more. But instead, everyone's going, oh, Europe. So we need to be careful about that. That aside, the announcement from Thierry Breton is 550,000 EU-funded shells will be delivered by the end of March. So that's just over half of what they pledged. Ukraine has purchased another 350,000 directly from the European EDTIB. And then there are shells provided through bilateral assistance. I don't know whether they should be included, whether it really matters, but Ukraine have got loads of other shells from other nations that have that bilaterally given shells to Ukraine. The production of shells in Europe is expected to be between 1.5 million and 1.7 million by the end of the year, and 2 million by 2025. So altogether, and then, especially if you include the Czech initiative of 800,000 shells with 300,000 looking like that's imminent, then that's whatever 1,000, whatever 1 million though. But is it part of that original pledge? Who cares? Czech Republic has secured about 8 because Czech Republic secured or went about doing this because Europe was struggling with 1 million. So, and this is kind of, yes, it's not the EU necessarily, but it's EU member states mainly doing this. Anyway, Czech Republic has secured about 800,000 shells, artillery shells from various suppliers around the world. It concerns 300,000 Soviet-style shells, 500,000 Western-made shells, and has found another 700,000 that can be purchased additionally. So that's 1.5 million potential shells, and I believe the funding's now up to paying for over 1 million. Not just the 800,000. So the first 800,000 will be delivered in batches throughout the year, and as soon as the funding is allocated, additional shells will follow. The Czech government estimates that the total purchase of 1.5 million shells will cost about $3.3 billion. Now, the Wall Street Journal has come out and said the suppliers of the ammunition for the Czechia for Czechia to hand over to Ukraine are allies of Russia. So there's some interesting dynamics here, because not only is it people not really selling out Russia, but they're just selling to the highest bidder, I guess. But those shells won't find their way into Russian hands. So actually there is a kind of zero-sum game approach to this, which is very significant. This is taking from the overall global supply of shells that essentially you can say either going to go to Ukraine or they're going to go to Russia. If they're going to go anywhere that means anything, or that they don't go anywhere, but those are your main options. So if they go to Ukraine, those shells cannot go to Russia. And if they're going to Ukraine from Russian allies, that is, I think, fairly significant. Czechia has received about 800,000, as mentioned, from various suppliers around the world, and found another 700,000. The first tranche of 300,000 is secured, with Germany contributing the most. While Prague is silent on where the ammunition is coming from, the publication Wall Street Journal claims that the Russian allies are among the suppliers. Trade agreements suggest that deliveries will be routed through Czechia or third countries to hide any direct link between the countries of origin and Ukraine, and to avoid exposing the supply to Moscow's wrath. I mean, I'm sure their intelligence will know this, but keeping it out of the public eye, I think, will be in everyone's best interest. But really, I think significant that. Now, German aid for Ukraine just adds a little bit of German aid here. Addendum from last week. Last Thursday, the city of Hamburg donated 6 ambulances to the Ukrainian capital Kyiv. As part of the donation, the country Weinmann Emergency Medical Technology donated additional suction pumps and medical ventilators. So good news from the Germans there, not necessarily from central government. NATO soldiers are already in Ukraine for arms control, intelligence operations and training, says El País, the Spanish newspaper. Wow, so it's not just about fixing missile. I mean, we knew this anyway, right? This to me is not news, but is out there now. And of course, if it's then out there and becomes normalized, then I think this helps along that discussion in terms of whether Ukraine will get further personnel aid from allies and whether that's acceptable, because already it's like, well, they're already there anyway. French proposal not to rule out sending soldiers against Russia opens a debate in which it is confirmed that there are already soldiers from NATO in Ukraine. I think that's fascinating that has come out into the public so explicitly. Right. Ukrainian government is allocating $128 million for procurement of attack drones. The Ukrainian government allocating that to purchase those for the military, according to the economy minister. And that is on the back of these strikes that are being so successful in taking out the oil refineries around Russia, although there were no big strikes last night. There's an unsuccessful one at Yaroslav, but it has been incredibly successful hitherto for the Ukrainians. And, that if that's a main source of income, and the claims are, say, 14% of Russian oil refining has been hit, then that will have an economic effect on Russia, which will, affect its ability to prosecute this war. Right, this is John Kirby, National Security Advisor, talking very forcefully here.
So, you called it a stalemate a little bit ago, and I think I'd push back a little bit on that. What we're seeing the Russians do, they got Avdiivka and the Donbass, and most of their effort has been in the east, the Donbass area. Now, you talked about this town in Zaporizhia, which is clearly more to the south. But they are pushing west from Avdiivka. The Ukrainians have about 3 lines of defense. The Russians are pushing up against that first one and trying to get to that second one. They're taking small towns and villages and farmland. Not so much because it's strategically valuable, but because they want to show wins. Particularly now with the election this weekend, they want to show that they're on the move. But they are physically on the move. Slowly, but they are. Because the Ukrainians don't have the artillery ammunition and the other capabilities they need to push back on the Russians and to take that ground back. That's why it's so critical, Shannon, that we get this supplemental funding for Ukraine. They desperately need it. Time is not on their side. It's not on our side either.
So, again, who's to blame in that? Well, I would say pretty much Mike Johnson and really the puppet, the marionette manipulator, I guess, behind him. This will get drowned out in today's mega thread, but worth highlighting. So we're going to spend a little bit of time on Russian arms exports because it's important for a number of reasons concerning the war in Ukraine. Okay, so on March 11th, 2024, research from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, so I'm going to call that SIPRI from now on, indicated that Russian arms exports fell by 53% between the periods 2014 to 18 and 2019 to 2023. Now, what's important about this, 2019 to 2023, is the period we're talking about. But actually, if you're talking about individual years, it's even worse than that. So as a result, Russia dropped from 2nd to 3rd place in the global arms export rankings. That is 3rd place from 2019 to 2023. If you look at 2023, Russia has dropped to 6th place. And what is far more challenging for Russia than understanding the overall figures is understanding where those arms deals for 2023 are coming from, and they are legacy deals that are going back to the 2010 to the 2000s and the 2010s. Some of these are really old deals that are being fulfilled as stuff gets made, as stuff gets developed, and these are essentially not new deals for new stuff. And yeah, there might be airplane engines, etc., etc. But yeah, it's really bad news for the Russians. Russian arms export volumes were 52% lower in 2023 than in 2022, while only 12 countries received major Russian arms in 2023 compared to 31 in 2019. The decline is likely due to several factors including Russia prioritizing equipment for operations in Ukraine due to continuous battlefield losses and reduced customer demand due to the risk of associated sanctions and global condemnation of Russia's responsibility for the war, and seeing Russian equipment, I would add, that isn't performing particularly well on the front lines. And if you're looking at, like, just honestly, if you're just an unknowing observer about anything previous to the war, and you're just looking at the war now, you'd be like, right, what do I want? Well, HIMARS for a start. Everyone's talking about ATACMS. Russian jets, I mean, they didn't seem to be doing much, and everyone's talking about Gripens and F-16. So, you can just, from that point of view, the kind of PR advertising point of view, there are so many better choices than Russian equipment. Anyway, Perun did a phenomenal video again yesterday on Russian arms export. I just want to look at a couple of slides from here and talk in general. I don't know if this will be cogent because I'm just going to slip my way through parts of the video, but we'll start with this.
In 2023, the figure fell from that already historic low point by more than 50%.
The figure being TIV. So this is the value of kit that you give worked out in like number of pieces and value. It's just an overall way of working out arms exports, right? Just to let you know the TIV and the numbers of bits of kit.
To 1,269. That meant that according to the SIPRI data, Russian arms exports had now fallen a casual approximately 84% from 2013, the last year before the annexation of Crimea. And there are a couple of factors, I think, which demonstrate things are probably even worse than just that raw number would suggest. For one, it's not like Russian arms exports are down just because no one's buying weapons at the moment. Perhaps unsurprisingly, given a couple of minor geopolitical developments, like a conventional land war in Europe, 2022 and 2023 were actually quite busy years on the arms market. So it's not the market that's collapsing, it's Russia's share of it. In 2012, Russia accounted for about 30% of the export value that SIPRI tracked. In 2018, that figure was 25%, in 2020, 15%, and in 2023, 4.4%. If you want to compare that to the smartphone market, in 2018, Russia was Samsung, and in 2023, they were a fractional share of Vivo. Problem two is that Russia...
So, yeah, loads of analysis goes on here to show that Russia's proportion of the market, and Russia's market shares is absolutely bottomed out. And across all the metrics, things are massively worrying for Russia. I mean, India, so percentage of transfers... What's happening is that certain countries look like their percentages increased, but they've increased because others have kind of dropped out. And then you look at the types of deals that have been done, so say with India, and you're thinking actually those aren't sustainable deals going forward. These are kind of legacy deals that are going to come to an end. And that's not great. And then when you look at other buyers, Belarus, Myanmar, Kazakhstan, China as well, but then China are now increasing their own, same with India, increasing their own indigenous production so that they are making their own stuff, which is not only kind of cheaper for them, arguably, depending, but that money will be inwardly invested rather than sending money to Russia. And it's not only that. So when you start buying arms off people, it's not just like going to a shop and buying 4 pints of milk and then leaving the shop and you got your milk, job done. It's like buying something from the shop and then needing that service by that shop on an ongoing basis for the time that you have that stuff. And so when you buy arms off, say, Russia, you're also buying into a maintenance schedule, your ongoing, acquisition of components and servicing, etc., etc., etc. And it ends up being a long-term trade relationship. Well, if you don't buy stuff off, then it's not just that you're not buying the equipment there and then and giving that money to Russia, but you are not also investing in Russia on an ongoing basis going forward. It just has huge ramifications, and to drop down to 4.4% in 2023 of the arms export market is absolutely controversial. So this goes to what I was talking about earlier, which is these legacy deals. This is India, and India being one of the main now importers of Russian equipment, even though they're making a lot of the stuff themselves. Now, if you look at when they ordered Russian equipment, 1998, 2001, 2013, 2018, 2020, and 2021. So this is order year of Russian arms transfers from 2012 to 2023. So from 2012 to 23, the stuff they're getting in was ordered in this time period, but nothing has been ordered since 2021. So that is significant. Majority was accounted for by an S-400 deal from 2018, which is 130 Erector launchers, transport Erector launchers, 77 48 N6s, and then you got some Konkurs, BMP2s, and 9M119, but those are licensed productions and Indian productions of that equipment. Anyway, just in 1998, when the longest legacy orders are dated to, the West was selling weapons to Russia. So in that time period, we were selling stuff to Russia. It's quite incredible how they have fallen and how much of an issue this is going to be for Russia going forward. Just really, really huge. And then China again, 2015, no orders after 2015. Goodness me, order year of Russian arms transfers. This is bad news for Russia. And then also what's interesting is traditionally aircraft have been the biggest proportion, the largest proportion within the overall arms exports of Russia, and that has dropped to a tiny real amount in comparison to previous years, but also proportionally much less significant as well. So goodness me, stuff is desperate. Things are desperate for the Russians. Anyway, go and check out Perun's video. It is so good. Lots of graphs for you to look at and get your teeth into. And it just is, none of it is good news for Russia at all. They are just in trouble. And of course, that means that, several things. It means that in terms of financing the war, they are going to struggle because arms exports will be putting some money in the coffers. But also the long-term positioning of Russia in kind of the context of the history of the Cold War, and it's US against Russia in terms of arms, and the sphere of influence that Russia is at the center of in terms of arms exports has now dwindled to a handful of countries. And US arms exports are doing very well, thank you very much, and they're flying off the shelves. This just puts the US in a much more commanding position going forward, and just Russia is losing influence and losing economic viability going forward. Its ability to project power around the world has been fundamentally undercut by going to war in Ukraine, in terms of attriting their own forces, attriting their own equipment so they don't have that equipment, and then everyone else running away from them in terms of wanting to buy kit off them. Just absolute shocker. Anyway, time to go on to geopolitical news, and we're going to start with now, I'm not trying to be anti-Catholic here or anything like that, but I'll tell you what, the Pope has had a bad week, a very bad week, and it's been made worse today. So the Pope has come out and congratulated Putin on winning his, scare quotes, election. No other Western nations and allies have done that. Not that he's a Western nation or ally, but he has joined the likes of Bolivia, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba, China, Azerbaijan, Iran, Kazakhstan, Belarus, Uzbekistan, Honduras, Tajikistan, Kuwait, Kyrgyzstan, and Pope Francis. I mean, wow. That is not a good move. And then it gets even worse. This is Catholic Arena reporting Pope Francis has criticised the European Union for how it deals with Hungary, saying that it, quote, seems to want to standardise everything, which should respect Hungarian uniqueness. It's like, don't you understand what they're trying to do with Hungary, which is trying to get them to be democratic and transparent and not corrupt? Hungary has sunk to the most corrupt nation in the EU by a long margin. But instead of criticising Hungary, you're criticising the EU for holding Hungary to account. So I'm sorry, the Pope's just, I don't know what's going on at the moment. I don't know who he's being advised by, but it's not cool, essentially. Now, I've talked about this before, but New York Times has obtained from a Serbian official a draft outline of the tentative Kushner deal. So Jared Kushner, the son-in-law of Trump. Trump is running for president 2024. It's all rather scary. If you look at Project 2025, goodness me, that gives me the absolute heebie-jeebies. If I was American, I'd be super worried. Like, I'm worried as an internationalist, but man, Project 2025 would essentially, the unitary executive theory that's at the core of the Project 2025, which is a blueprint for governance if Trump was to be elected, essentially put forward by the Heritage Foundation and others, sets out for basically an approach towards dictatorship in my books, especially when the checks and balances, when Trump did such a good job of stacking the Supreme Court and the lower courts when he was president, the checks and balances that would stop that from happening are less likely to work as checks and balances. Anyway, Jared Kushner is seeming to do very well out of, we know that he's doing very well out of Saudi Arabia to the tune of, there's $3 billion of investment, of which $2 billion, I think, comes from Saudi Arabia for his hedge fund managing, where he's not exactly a hedge fund manager, he's like real estate. Anyway, going back to real estate, he's been granted a 99-year lease at no charge and a right to build a luxury hotel, apartments and a museum on a historic Belgrade site. So that's in Serbia, which is part of the Russian sphere of influence, which is, Hungary, Serbia, etc., etc. Slovakia just up the road, that seems to be veering, at least from their administration, towards the Russian sphere of influence. And Jared Kushner is right in the middle, making money, doing sweet deals with Serbian President Vucic. This is grifting, and this is highly political, and this is damned worrying in my book. Now, I know you might get sick of me moaning about Trump, but he's going to be possibly the most important human being on earth in November 2024, and I swear he's the wrong choice for so many reasons. Listen to what this guy says. Caught hot mic, just come out this. And I keep telling you, he loves his dictators. If you are not convinced by this, if you are somehow still denying what Trump is like, listen to Trump's own words.
Are we close to seeing Mr. Kim here at the White House?
Could happen. I mean,
they talked about that yesterday
I would
with
have
Mike
him.
Pompeo?
Yeah, I think it's something that could happen. Yeah. Hey, he's the head of a country, and I mean, he is the strong head. Mm-hmm. Don't let anyone think anything different. Right. He speaks, and his people sit up at attention. I want my people to do the same.
Well,
right, he's talking about Kim Jong-un, and he's saying, yeah, I think he could come to the White House. First of all, now I know we should work with dictators to turn them into not dictators, but he didn't want to turn him into a not dictator because of what he then says, which is, let's remind ourselves, it's worth listening to a second time.
Are we close to seeing Mr. Kim here at the White House?
Could happen. I mean,
they talked about that yesterday
I would
with
have
Mike
him.
Pompeo?
Yeah, I think it's something that could happen. Yeah. Hey, he's the head of a country, and I mean, he is the strong head.
So he's the head of the country. Okay, whatever. But the way that Trump's saying this is good. He's the head of a country and he's a strong head. In other words, it's not like, he's a dictator and that's bad. He's strong because he's dictatorial, and actually that's undemocratic, and we absolutely don't like that. He says he's strong and that's cool. And that's what I like. And do you know why I like him? And this is the bit that scares me.
Don't let anyone think anything different.
Don't let anyone think anything different. He's a good, strong. The implication he's strong, and being strong is what's good and what I like.
He speaks and his people sit up at attention. He speaks and people sit up to attention.
I want my
do the same.
I want my people to do the same. I want the American people to do the same to me as they do to Kim Jong-un. You know, the guy that shoots dissenters with anti-aircraft guns on a runway. You know, that guy. My mind gets blown consistently by the rhetoric coming from that man. Right, US Senator Lindsey Graham, who's kind of all over the shop with Ukraine. Well, he's not. He's strongly in support of Ukraine, but the way that he shows his support is tempered by, I think, the compromat on him due to his sexual proclivities. And I think that allows the whether it be the Trump caucus, the MAGA caucus, or whoever else, to pull strings with Lindsey Graham. And that's frustrating because he's a person that could and has previously done an awful lot to defend Ukraine and their efforts to defend themselves. Well, he's now in Kiev, which I think is a really good thing. So it's good to see him out there. Now, talking about Hungary, last Friday, 50,000 Hungarians that were tired of Orban, selling the country to Russia and turning it into the poorest country in Europe and the most corrupt. So both showed up at a rally promoting presidential hopeful Peter Magyar. Orban should be worried. Keep an eye on this guy. Now, I reported this. I didn't know it's 50,000. It's reported 5,000 previously, but that could be a mistake on either of these ones. So I don't know what the numbers were. I just hope that an awful lot of Hungarians, were out in support of this guy and support of moving back towards democratic ideals. Now, in Putin's post-election speech, he doubled down on earlier threats and accusations, yet he also openly spoke about Navalny, mentioning his name for the first time. He dismissed the American election process as completely undemocratic. So, Navalny thing I mentioned already, but it's hilarious that he has accused the American election system being undemocratic. It's just so much projection. He also threatened to create a sanitary zone on Ukrainian land in the east in the future, possibly alluding to nuclear strikes. He was even more brazen than usual, but only spent a minute on the actual discussion of his campaign opponents and results of the election at the end of the speech, because his campaign opponents are irrelevant. No one was allowed to campaign on a war. You're not allowed to mention the war. You weren't allowed to criticize Putin. It's just what kind of democracy? Well, it's not a democracy. It's a dictatorship. So the three extra candidates, says Shashank Joshi, quoting from The Economist, for which he works, placed on the ballot to create an appearance of choice, polled around 5% or lower. They did not campaign and all spoke approvingly of the war and of Mr. Putin. Employees were told to vote at their workplaces where they could be monitored and to provide screenshots of their filled-in ballots. To prevent sabotage, the Kremlin created a geolocation voting app which ties a voter's mobile phone number to a particular polling station. In other words, it's just these mechanisms against all the pillars of transparent, free and fair elections. Many crossed out Mr. Putin's name and replaced it with Navalny. Some voters in Moscow held onto their ballots, took them to the cemetery where Navalny is buried and placed them at his grave. And that's brave given all the things that Putin put or the Kremlin put in place. Now, and a good analysis here. I would recommend Western politicians watch Putin's address to the Federal Assembly. It becomes clear who Russia is fighting against and what the next steps will be. Putin defines Russia as, quote, a pillar of traditional values on which human civilization is built. Although instead of the promised values, Russia only has a wrapper behind which a misanthropic ideology hides, but Putin is convinced that he bases himself on, quote, the majority of people in the world, in particular millions of citizens of Western countries. This should be taken seriously. These words are backed up by aggressive political movements that once were financed by Russia and now want to repeat Putin's success in their own countries. War was not only a military dimension, but also informational, economic, value dimensions and others. Long ago, this war has crossed the borders into Western democracies, which have taken their own security for granted for too long. The very existence of the free world threatens dictators with the loss of power. Therefore, there is no such price that Putin would not be willing to pay for the destruction of freedom. It is not surprising that his main message to Russian citizens implies that, quote, without war, there is no Russia. It means that the time for neutrality is over. Sooner or later, the majority of Russian citizens who chose the position of, quote, non-resistance to the war because, quote, the government knows better what to do, will sacrifice their lives and the future of their children on the altar built by their non-resistance. Released from captivity people tell that the Russians told them that when Ukraine collapses, the Ukrainians, together with the Russian army, will set off to conquer the world. If we do not stop Putin in Ukraine, he will go further after a while. There's something else to add to this, and this has been mentioned a few times recently, is that if Russia is able to maintain their control over the Donbass and, you know, the wider occupied territories of Zaporizhia, Kherson, Crimea, they will just utilize Ukrainians in their armed forces to do their dirty work. No matter what Western politicians recognize or not, their countries are safe as long as Ukraine holds the line. It is possible right now to give Ukraine everything it needs to repel Russian aggression. Otherwise, it's possible to hesitate for too long and miss the moment when developed democracies are faced with the need to pay the price with the lives of their own citizens. Right, now, Putin's lackey and former German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder, so he is very pro-Russian, been involved with Russia since leaving his position as the German Chancellor. He's praised Olaf Scholz, the present German Chancellor, for his peaceful position and unwillingness to give Ukraine Taurus missiles. And of course he's going to say that. He's absolutely wrapped up in the Russian information space. Quote, I think Olaf Scholz is doing what I expect of a German Chancellor at the moment. If someone as German Chancellor is in favour of peace, if someone is called Peace Chancellor, is that a negative? Schröder said. He has supported the idea of SPD parliamentary faction leader Rolf Merzennich regarding the need for the war freeze, for which he would strongly criticise. And Merzennich had a speech recently in the Bundestag, if I remember correctly, where he was advocating like the Russian narrative. So the SPD does have a lot of connections to Russia over historically speaking, and one of the biggest connections is indeed Gerhard Schröder. Now, on the other hand, Lithuania and Germany have officially declared that they do not recognise the presidential elections of Russia as legitimate, and I'm hoping that this is the formal position of all of Europe, really. According to the Lithuanian Foreign Minister, the voting that took place in Russia is a tragic farce. German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock, who's doing really well at the moment and positioning herself very, very competently, said Germany condemns the, quote, elections without a choice in Russia. Fun fact, Putin won 98.99% of the vote in Chechnya. Of course he did. Right, so there you go. France takes note of the expected result of the presidential elections. So, A, we take note, we don't congratulate. We take note, and it was expected. Right? Who are you fooling here? Which will see Vladimir Putin remains president of the Russian Federation for a fifth term. The electoral process in Russia took place in the context of intensified repression of civil society and any form of opposition to the regime, with ever-increasing restrictions on freedom and expression and a ban on the operation of independent media. France also condemns the organisation of so-called elections. I love this. Well done, France. In the Ukrainian territories temporarily occupied by Russia, the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol, as well as part of the Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia and Kherson regions. The illegal organisation of the so-called elections in the Ukrainian territories temporarily occupied by Russia constitutes a new violation of international law and of the United Nations Charter. France does not and will never recognise the holding and results of those so-called elections and reaffirms its attachment to the sovereignty, independence, unity and territorial integrity of Ukraine. So a little nuanced approach there, because they are definitely not accepting the legitimacy of the elections within Ukraine. And actually, they just say they note the process within Russia, within the Russian Federation, rather than condemn it, but they do condemn aspects of what Russia has done. So, you know, I think that's good, is good enough at the moment, and I'm glad that France has come out and said that. In Tbilisi, in Georgia, they're looking forward to their own elections in October, when the Russian-friendly party will be annihilated. Well, maybe Tim White could be correct. I hope so. But who knows what kind of vote rigging will take place under Georgia Dream, who are becoming increasingly, as the ruling party there, increasingly pro-Russian. Meanwhile, they join in the Noon Against Putin protest. So that's the one I talked about before, where at noon they protested at polling stations around the world. The banner here says, enough of Putin, enough chaos, war and repression. And just something to mention here that I think is worth talking about. Right, we talk about geopolitics here all the time, we talk about nations in Europe, and when you're across the pond in the US, to some degree in the UK as well, because we're that bit removed, but particularly say in the US, where you've got 300 330 million in your own population. You've got a massive country where a large number of people don't leave the United States to go on holiday, because you can holiday in the United States very well. It's such a big country geographically and in terms of population that, so on and so forth. So international news doesn't filter through as much into the general psyche. Right. What that means is that when things are reported, they're sometimes simplified or reported in a way where people can understand it more easily, but actually it can be a little bit insulting to the people you're talking about. So here's a great example. So this is Jakub Janda, who's from Czechia, saying, "We are no effing small ex-Soviet satellite. We are Czechia, a proud 10 million country whose president does phone calls with president of Taiwan, and we just got about 1 million artillery shells to Ukrainian defenders while Germany and France do a pissing contest over egos, and not to mention the 5 months of a congressional impasse." Now, this is the Wall Street Journal, and I do agree with this kind of anger, actually. A small ex-Soviet satellite state goes hunting for arms for Ukraine. So this is a story about Czechia finding 1 million shells, right? Or 800,000 and possibly up to 1.5 million. You've got Petr Pavel doing amazing stuff. You've got Fiala, the Prime Minister, doing good stuff. Czechia is a massively important member of the European Union, given the legacy and history involved with Russia or the Soviet Union. Now, the problem of only seeing, not even calling it Czechia, just a small ex-Soviet satellite state, is you are seeing nations in terms of the old Soviet Empire. In other words, this kind of reporting actually perpetuates Russian narratives, because it sees people. It's like seeing when women are reported on the news, they are far more likely to be reported by their marital status than men. Either in terms of, calling them Mrs. whatever, or saying this is whoever's husband, where you hardly ever say that in terms of the men. And so it's just some really interesting stats that go. I mean, I've written articles on this. There's fascinating stuff that goes on in terms of like giving you a false sense of reality there. But it plays into a narrative of a kind of imbalance and a superiority in men. That, okay, you can, whatever, I don't want an argument about that. But this is a similar sort of thing where nations are seen only in terms of their relationship to now the Russian Federation or the Soviet Union, rather than nations in and of themselves. They've like, you don't look at Britain or you don't look at India and call it repeatedly. And this is the last century, and you don't call it the ex member of the British Empire, India. You're like, no, we're just going to talk about India. And so by doing that, you would see India in terms of what it means to Britain, and you're framing your understanding of India. And so consistently to talk about, and you can include it in the article that that its Soviet heritage might be important for what you're trying to say, but to see it to title the article by calling Czechia just a small ex-Soviet satellite state it is insulting to Czechia, and I think it doesn't do anyone any favours, and it does perpetuate the Russian narrative, which is there are no borders to Russia. Everyone is potentially part of the Russian Empire, which is what Medvedev was recently saying. And I don't think this helps. So I agree with Jakub Janda's protestations there. Now, talking about Czechia, Czech Minister of Agriculture Marek Výborný said on Czech TV that Czechia will propose to ban imports of Russian and Belarusian grain to the European Union at next week's European Council meeting. So this would be very significant if Russian grain is banned within the EU. Quote, "We will insist that grains and oilseed cultures be included in the sanction list and not enter Europe." According to Eurostat, last year the EU imported 1.5 million tonnes of grain from Russia, which is more than before the war in Ukraine. For example, Spain, which had a poor harvest, imported many times more. There is no reason why we should support the aggressor by buying Russian grain in Europe. Výborný added, according to the minister, there is no danger that food prices will rise fundamentally after a possible ban on Russian grain imports. Czechia has surplus for export. There are surpluses all over the world, the minister emphasised. Margarita Balastiko Stikova, a member of a parliamentary committee on agriculture from the opposition ANO movement, would support a ban, but she said it will be difficult to enforce. Quote, customs checks will have to be carried out, railway cars will have to be sealed, otherwise traders will be able to go around the ban. She said, well, interesting, and hopefully, it can be worked out, because I think that would be another, kick in the teeth to the Russians. And very good news here, according to Ben Hodges, the latest example of Romanian contributions to collective defence. MK has for years been an important hub in the Black Sea region for NATO air policing and US logistics and training. How often do we hear about NATO flights taking off from Romania? Romania now has an air base that's going to be training F-16 pilots for NATO more broadly, as well as Ukrainian pilots. MK expansion is important for implementing Black Sea strategy. So this is the news that a new base is being built in Romania. That is massive. It will be 17% larger than Ramstein. Romania builds the largest base in NATO Europe, $2.5 billion project, an unsinkable carrier at the Black Sea. Sister base is built in the middle of a mountain plateau that will be the control center of Southeast Europe. So really significant. And again, this goes to the idea that what has Russia achieved by invading Ukraine? They've strengthened NATO. They've given 2 extra members to NATO, and a massive military base is being built nearer to Russia again. And the Americans are stocking Finnish and Swedish military bases with some of their own personnel and equipment. This is just a huge shot in their own foot for the Russians. Anyway, thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe and share. Really appreciate your support. Take care and speak.